Greetings everybody, this is Dr. Jonathan Cox, your resident race scholar, here with another mini lecture on race. Now in this mini lecture, I will be addressing the social and historical construction of race. Throughout this short video, I will also expand on three main points. 1. Race is socially constructed but real in its consequences. 2. Race is a historical construction. And 3, race is systematically rooted in American culture to create, establish, maintain, and enhance group differences. Now to start off, we need to understand what race is in the first place. Now when people in the United States meet other people, they often want to know what their racial identity is. Now this is often encapsulated in the question, well, what are you? Now, race refers to a group of people who share physical and cultural traits as well as a common ancestry. Now the idea of race, it really implies that people all over the world can be divided into biologically discrete and exclusive groups based on these physical and cultural traits. Now a similar concept that people often confuse with race is ethnicity. Now ethnicities, on the other hand, these are group identities that are based on notions of similar or shared history, culture, and kinship. So how exactly are they different? Race is typically something that is externally attributed, right? Now that means it's based on what you look like, your hair color, your body type, skin color, things like that. Now people can self-identify as particular races, but they may be classified differently by other people regardless of their own self-identification. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is usually something that people self-identify into based on their perceived shared history and experiences. Ethnicity is a little bit more malleable, at least historically speaking, although race does change as well over time. Now while these are technically distinct concepts, socially speaking, right, in everyday life, they're often seen as the same thing. Now, getting back to our three main points for today, what do I mean when I say that race is socially constructed? Now, acknowledging that race is socially constructed means that we recognize that there is no scientific basis for race. It's made up. It's a completely made up concept. Genetically speaking, humans are all 99.9% the same. Race was created really as a way to separate people into distinctive groups for purely social reasons. In other words, to maintain inequalities and position certain races above or below other races. Now, you can now understand how race is socially constructed, but despite it being this made-up concept, it is actually very real in its consequences. And so what does that mean? That race is real in its consequences really just refers to the fact that people are treated very differently based on their race. Now, this includes things like negative stereotyping, racial discrimination, and racism. Now, these consequences also include systemic and structural outcomes. For example, Black Americans were left out of historical social programs like the GI Bill and other New Deal legislation that led to whites having about 10 times as much wealth on average as Black Americans do today. And also, Black and Latinx children, they're more likely to be suspended or expelled from schools for the same behavior as white students. So here in America, race really functions on three main levels, right? First, the individual or micro level through face-to-face interactions. Second, the meso level through processes and mechanisms such as group size. And lastly, institutionally, or the macro level, through institutions such as education, family, or community. Now, the micro level of race is where we see how people classify others based on race, and then how they treat other people differently or similarly based on the race that they perceive them to be. Today, race has really become a part of our worldview. It forms a fundamental piece of how we understand the world. Now, one way we can see how race has become institutionalized in the United States is through the census. Now, the US government now officially recognizes 5 racial groups: white, Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. And there's a 6th group that is labeled some other race. Now, as you can see, these definitions are in many ways tied to geography as well. Now, if you look at these definitions, some people may notice some very interesting things that come up. First, there is no Hispanic or Latinx category. According to the United States government, Hispanic origin is only an ethnicity, it's not a race. Socially speaking, however, many Hispanic and Latinx people see that as their racial identity, at least here in the United States. Second, all people from the Middle East and North Africa are considered white. However, there are inherent problems with this type of classification. Aside from the fact that many Middle Eastern and North African Americans definitively classify themselves as not white, this classification also has social and historical implications. How does this change the historical narratives about Egyptians, for instance, whom history records as clearly being black? That helps us to think more about one of our focus points for today's lecture as well, that race is systemically rooted in American culture to create, establish, maintain, and enhance group differences. We can explore this idea further by taking a quick look at some well-known people from various racial and ethnic backgrounds. Now, continuing with the discussion of how Middle Eastern and North African peoples are technically classified as white per the US government, how do your ideas change if you think about Gal Gadot, the Israeli actress best known right now for her role as Wonder Woman, or DJ Khaled, the hip-hop mogul who was born to Palestinian parents? According to official definitions, both of these individuals are white. However, there is little doubt that DJ Khaled is seen as distinctly not white, at least here in the United States. We could also think about two actors, Charlie Sheen, whose birth name is actually Carlos Estevez, and Gina Torres. Both of these actors are Latinx. Charlie Sheen is Hispanic and white, while Gina Torres is Cuban. But how might these two people be treated differently based on their racial appearance? Finally, looking at multiracial people even further illustrates how race is socially constructed. Take, for example, President Barack Obama and actor Wentworth Miller. Both are biracial black and white. That means they had one black parent and one white parent. However, they are viewed very differently by society. Obama is seen almost exclusively as black, while Wentworth is often assumed to be only white. Looking at these pictures of various well-known people and thinking about how they are classified racially helps us further demonstrate the social construction of race. Now, while this can seem arbitrary, we know that race is real in its consequences. People experience life very differently because of their race. They experience racial discrimination, racism, and bias. There are vastly unequal outcomes for different racial groups in educational attainment, income and wages, housing, health and health care, and the criminal justice system, just to name a few things. Race is also used to distribute and redistribute resources, along with racism as a justification for maintaining white racial dominance. Yes, race is made up, but it's very real at this point in society. Now we can turn our attention to the idea that race is a historical construction. In order to tell the story of race in the Americas, we have to go back to at least 1492, when Christopher Columbus and his crew arrived in the Caribbean. Now, Columbus didn't think of himself as white, nor did he think of natives as Indians. How then did these monikers emerge? When Christopher Columbus encountered the native peoples of the Caribbean, he actually found them to be peaceful and generous, which is different from many of the stories that we are told. Now, the Spanish conquistadors, they found civilizations in the Americas created by indigenous peoples that were far more advanced than those that existed in Europe. They were better organized, they had better infrastructure, there were more people were generally just living better. Now, these conquistadors destroyed the indigenous peoples in their quest for gold using their superior weapons. Now, English colonizers also wanted land and riches in the same way that the Spanish had gotten, and so they shot their racist shot in what is now the US. Now, these white colonizers abducted Africans and brought them to the Americas for labor, and over time developed racist ideologies that justified the enslavement of an entire group of people based solely on the color of their skin. When we think about slavery, it definitely was not anything new to humans. However, the racialization of slavery that happened in the United States, this was a very, very new thing. Now, in ancient times, it was generally circumstance that led to slavery. People were captured in war and forced to be slaves, or were members of rival social groups, or they became so poor that selling themselves into bondage was the only way to survive. Now, additionally, slavery was often a temporary condition, meaning that through enough time or enough work, or just a change in those circumstances, people could get out of slavery. In some societies, slaves actually had rights, such as being able to marry or own property, and in other societies, slaves were adopted as part of the family after a certain number of years. Slavery as a result of European colonization and American slavery were not like this at all, however. One significant event that we can discuss that helps to showcase how race was constructed historically is Bacon's Rebellion. Now, in Bacon's Rebellion, white indentured servants joined forces with enslaved Africans and freedmen to protest their conditions. Now, this massive rebellion, in which protesters demanding an end to their servitude burned Jamestown to the ground, and it was a clear threat to the status quo. In the aftermath, whites were granted additional rights and privileges in an effort to ensure that they did not act in solidarity with enslaved Africans. Now, as Bacon's Rebellion shows us, blacks and whites in the beginning of colonial America, they were interacting. And so slave codes were enacted to prevent these interactions. And that furthered the separation and distinction between whites and blacks. Privileges were given to white servants that were not given to enslaved blacks. And eventually, all Africans were enslaved and all whites were deemed free, which further solidified the idea of race. Hopefully now you have a better idea about race and understand how it is a social construction, a historical construction, and that it is systemically rooted in American culture to help create, establish, maintain, and enhance group differences. There's a lot more to learn, however, so go out there and see what else you can find out.